member for Carleton.
I regret to inform the House of Commons that I will be terminating my remarks as soon as the Prime Minister comes in and announces that there will be a full-scale parliamentary investigation into his interference in SNC-Lavalin. I guess I will not be terminating my remarks just yet, Mr. Speaker. They will have to go on. And I'm getting some heckles from across the way from my colleagues. Somebody yelled across the way that I have a crooked tie. It is better to have a crooked tie than a crooked leader.
I'd ask honourable members, including member for Carleton, to be careful in the choice of words and not use characterizations of individual members. Order. And we should always avoid characterizing individual members as opposed to a government, a party, etc., or policies or decisions. That's another matter. Now, member for Carleton.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. There are new developments in the SNC-Lavalin scandal just breaking today, and I rise today to bring them to the House's attention. As you'll recall, Mr. Speaker, the Justice Committee decided to convene an investigation into the Prime Minister's interference in the criminal prosecution of the company known as SNC-Lavalin. That investigation, unfortunately, was short-lived. As revelations about the Prime Minister and his team's 20 points of contact with the former Attorney General, in which they made veiled threats, in which they interfered, in which they applied inappropriate pressure, as all of this came to light in the committee, members of the Liberal side, who constitute a majority, voted to shut down the investigation altogether. I was present when that happened, and it was clear that the government had engaged in a cover-up. Now, that being said, we concluded at the time that there was still hope of getting to the truth, and that hope resided in the Ethics Committee. As such, numerous members of this House wrote the chairman of that committee, who would confirm that a motion to carry out an investigation into the SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal was in order. Roughly a week later, members convened at the Ethics Committee under the leadership of that chair and debated whether or not the committee should proceed with an investigation. One Liberal member on the committee had previously voted for a full-scale investigation into a full-scale public inquiry, and thus it was expected that he might be supportive of allowing the Ethics Committee to proceed in carrying out that investigation right within the parliamentary precinct. When presented with the opportunity to do so, and in vote in favor of the motion allowing the investigation to go ahead, he began to speak and said that he was not ruling out a future investigation at the committee, that perhaps at some future date an investigation could proceed, but that doing so would be premature before the Justice Committee had received all of its written submissions and before that Justice Committee had decided to conclude its own work. A second Liberal MP, the member for Ottawa-Vanier, said in a post-committee scrum with the media. I believe that today we had a conversation on the fact that the Ethics Commissioner is currently studying, and that's why we are waiting for him to get back to us and report. Also, the Justice Committee is working on it as we speak. The chair of that committee will receive more information, so it is premature for us to go forward. I emphasize, premature for us to go forward. So, Mr. Speaker, 2 members of the Liberal delegation on the Ethics Committee expressed an openness to having a full-scale committee investigation into the SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal. But they had concluded that it would be premature to do so until such time as the Justice Committee received all of its written submissions and heard all of its testimony and concluded its own work on the file. In fairness to those 2 Liberal members, while I disagree with them, it's a reasonable point of view. No need to have 2 committees doing the same thing at one time. In other words, why not wait to find out what Justice Committee was going to do with all of the testimony it had received and what it would eventually do with the then forthcoming written submissions of text messages that both the former Attorney General and Gerald Butts were to provide. Well, now the Justice Committee has done that. It has completely terminated the investigation. It has received all the written submissions. Those submissions have now been published for all eyes to see. The Justice Committee's work is known, and according to Liberal members as of this morning, who met in a secret in-camera meeting, that committee will do no more work on this file. So, the 2 Liberal members of the Ethics Committee who were waiting on justice to wrap up in order to get final evidence that that committee report would provide is done. And they are ready now. They can no longer claim that it is premature for the Ethics Committee to begin its work. So I report to the House of Commons today, Mr. Speaker, that next Tuesday would be the appropriate day for the Ethics Committee to consider whether or not to proceed with the investigation into the Prime Minister's SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal. I note that he has attempted to shut down 2 previous investigations. That might cause pessimism among members of this House. However, I also note that there is reason for hope and optimism in that at least 2 Liberal members of the Ethics Committee have now said that their opposition to an investigation was time limited. In other words, that because it was premature at the time the motion for such investigation came before the committee, they may now have changed their mind because all of the information that another committee has to provide is now provided. And so the conversation now shifts over to the Ethics Committee, where we will once again debate whether to open an investigation into this file. Now, the Prime Minister has tried to put this matter to rest by shutting it down. Now, when I say the term shut down, I'm quoting the Prime Minister's former Treasury Board president. This is not an allegation of an opposition MP. These are the words of a former member of the Prime Minister's inner circle, a doctor, a woman to whom the Prime Minister entrusted one of the most senior cabinet positions any Prime Minister can offer. She has indicated she believes the government is trying to shut down the investigation into this scandal. It's not working. The Prime Minister has been incapable of grabbing this scandal and forcing it underground. Every time he tries, the people of Canada, as well as conscientious members of his own caucus, speak up against him. So I believe that he will have to conclude 1 week from today that his only recourse is to open the entire matter up for all eyes to see.
Yep.
As he was fond of saying in the last election, sunshine is the greatest disinfectant. So let's lift the curtains over at the Ethics Committee and let the sunshine pour in so that everyone can see the truth.
Sunny ways.
Sunny ways, my friends, sunny ways, as a Prime Minister we all know once said. So, Mr. Speaker, I put you and the House on notice that next Tuesday, a week from today, we will all be watching carefully as Liberal members join with Conservative and NDP members to determine whether or not to end the cover-up and open up a full-scale investigation to get to the truth in this matter. With that notice having been given, Mr. Speaker, I now turn your attention to another important legal matter. We are lawmakers, ergo we mustn't be law breakers. And there is an important law passed into effect in the previous Parliament called the Reform Act.
Oh, yeah.
And that bill came from the member for Wellington Halton Hills, excuse me.
Great member.
He has long been a student of Parliament and an advocate for its supremacy. The member came forward with this bill in the previous Parliament with the intended purpose of limiting the executive branch's ability to commandeer the House of Commons at the expense of the public interest. And it was under the previous government that the bill was in fact passed, and it did two principal things, Mr. Speaker. One, took away the legal authority of party leaders to ban candidates from running. It used to be in the Election Act that you could not be a candidate for a political party unless you had a signature from the leader of that party. That created a bias within the Act in favor of the party leadership and against the grassroots. The Reform Act instead allowed the party to assign any authority it chose to have the power to accept or reject candidates. So in other words, a party could say that a local electoral district association president or some other trusted figure has the authority to accept or reject candidacies. But no longer would it be a given under law that such authority would reside exclusively in the hands of the leader. Now, it is possible for a party to craft its own constitution, as any free organization can in an open civil society, to assign that power to its leader. But that decision now rests with the party and not with the law. So that was the first change. The second change that the Reform Act made was particularly relevant to today's conversation. It stated that at the first caucus meeting of every party after an election occurs, there must be a vote on whether or not to apply a set of rules to determine how the expulsion of members of that caucus. In other words, in the past, party leaders have been able to just banish people from the caucus arbitrarily. This law empowered caucuses to create a set of enforceable rules that are embedded in legislation whereby no one can be removed from a caucus without a vote of the caucus members. At the very first Conservative caucus meeting after the last election, we decided to vote in favor of applying that rule to our caucus. So, the Conservative Party, as it stands now and in this Parliament, cannot remove members from caucus without holding a vote of caucus members. In other words, a party leader cannot simply wake up one day and say that Mr. Smith is no longer a member of the Conservative Party. Instead, caucus members need to vote on the future of Mr. Smith. And that brings us to today's debate, because we are now hearing rumors of retaliation against two courageous whistleblowers in the Liberal ranks. Both the former Attorney General and the former Treasury Board President had the incredible audacity to tell the truth about the Prime Minister's conduct in the SNC-Lavalin affair. Numerous of the Prime Minister's top supporters in caucus have gone to media outlets and suggested that they should be banished from the caucus altogether because they dared speak up and defend that truth. The argument goes, should be punished for allowing Canadians to learn that the Prime Minister interfered in a criminal prosecution. Here's the hiccup, the legal hiccup. It turns out that the Liberal caucus failed to follow the law and hold a vote at its first caucus meeting to determine whether or not there would be rules for the expulsion of members. In other words, if the caucus decides to expel these members, that expulsion might be illegal. I want to read you some background. This is a letter that the Honourable Member for Wellington Halton Hills wrote to the current Attorney General. Dear Minister, I'd like to congratulate you on your new role as the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada. In a letter to the previous Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada dated February 29, 2016, I brought to the Minister's attention the possible non-compliance of Section 49(8) of the Parliament of Canada Act by members of the Cabinet. I also sent a letter to the Deputy Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada dated May 11, 2016, voicing the same concern. Both the Minister and Deputy Minister did not respond to me directly, and as such, I have no idea of what action, if any, was taken. I am now bringing this matter directly to your attention for your consideration and action. As you are aware, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General is the Chief Law Officer of the Crown, responsible for ensuring that the administration of public affairs is in accordance with the law, and responsible for upholding the rule of law. The Attorney General has a duty to provide objective legal advice in order to ensure that government action complies with the law. Given that the government is bound by the rule of law as well as the Attorney General's advice on legal affairs, traditionally it must be accepted by Cabinet even if it is unpopular policy. As you are also aware, the Reform Act passed in the House of Commons on February 25, 2015, passed in the Senate on June 22, 2015, received royal assent on June 23, 2015, and subsequently came into force on October 26, 2015. It amended the Parliament of Canada Act. According to Section 49(8) of the Parliament of Canada Act, appended for ease of reference, at the first meeting following a general election, the caucus of every recognized party in the House of Commons must conduct a separate recorded vote among the caucus members in respect of each of the following questions. A, whether Sections 49(2) and 49(3) are to apply in respect of the caucus. B, whether Section 49(4) is to apply in respect of the caucus. C, whether Section 49(5)(1) and 3 are to apply in respect of the caucus. And D, whether Section 49(5)(4) and Section 49.6 are to apply in respect of the caucus. Furthermore, Section 49(8) stipulates that as soon as feasible after the conduct of the votes, the chair of the caucus shall inform the Speaker of the House of Commons of the outcome of each vote. It has been publicly reported by various news media, one report of which is appended for ease of reference, that the Liberal members of Parliament, including ministers, did not comply with Section 49(8) of the Parliament of Canada Act, instead deciding to defer the 4 votes. This appears to be in contravention of the Parliament of Canada Act. The Minister of Justice and Attorney General is responsible for upholding the rule of law and ensuring Cabinet acts in accordance with the law, and is ultimately accountable to the House of Commons. I ask that you uphold your constitutional and statutory responsibility and take necessary steps to ensure that the government complies with Section 49(8) of the Parliament of Canada Act. While Section 49(8) concerns the conduct of not just ministers but all members of Parliament recognized in the House of Commons, it is important that, according to open and accountable, to note that according to Open and Accountable Government, a document, ministers are to be held to the highest standards of conduct for all their actions, including those that are not directly related to their official functions. Ministers, therefore, are therefore expected to adhere to these standards in circumstances whether they are acting as a minister or a member of Parliament or a private citizen. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Please do not hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. In other words, the member was laying out very clearly that there are laws that determine how a caucus must conduct itself, and that those laws determine how members can or cannot be expelled. So far, the Liberal Party is not in respect of those laws. All other caucuses held votes to ensure that they were in compliance with the Parliament of Canada Act. To simplify it, this is what it means. If you're sitting back home right now, you're wondering whether your member of Parliament works for you or works for the party leader, ask yourself who can remove that member of Parliament from his or her caucus.
Exactly.
If the answer is that the leader simply removes the caucus member, then apparently that caucus member works for the leader. If, on the other hand, as is the case in the Conservative Party, your member of Parliament works in a caucus that is bound by the Parliament of Canada Act to ensure that no one can be removed except by vote of a majority of MPs in that caucus, then your MP works for you. That's how simple it is. Now, it's not that the Liberal caucus failed to decide it, to give the leader the power to remove members of its caucus. It's that it broke the law requiring that the caucus itself set rules for expulsion of members. And in so doing, we are now in this, the Liberal caucus is now in a legal twilight zone, unable to tell anybody the legal procedure required for 2 of its senior members to be expelled from the caucus. I understand it has been brought to my attention, Mr. Speaker, that Liberal caucus meetings have been going on all day, that Ontario Liberals have gathered to discuss the future of the former Attorney General and former Treasury Board President. They are discussing whether or not those 2 distinguished parliamentarians should be punted from the Liberal caucus altogether. But here's the problem. They can't do it legally until they have addressed the requirement in the Parliament of Canada Act, which stipulates that they must decide whether a leader or a caucus has the power to do that. The Liberal Party very much risks finding itself in yet another legal crisis in the next day. Tomorrow its caucus will meet, and I understand that there may well be a decision to expel members of the caucus. But we don't know how that decision will be made, because so far the Liberals are in violation of the Parliament Canada Act, which stipulates how exactly that procedure carries itself out.
Shameful.
It is shameful that the Liberal Party has found a way to break the law, even in circumstances that relate to its own caucus management. I might add that while this sounds really complicated, it's actually quite simple. The Act just says, once you have an election, caucus gets into a room, they hold a vote on the rules for expulsions of members. We did it, took us about 10 minutes. We as a group decided that caucus members could only be expelled through a vote of the full caucus. That stripped a future leader of the ability to remove anyone arbitrarily, and it empowered MPs from whether they're in the front, middle, or back bench to be equal in making that decision.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. And there are members of the NDP who I believe did exactly the same thing. They held the same vote, and they were required to under the Act. And so I believe, it is my understanding, though I wasn't there, that they did as well. But of course the Liberal Party refused to abide by this legal requirement and make that administrative decision on its first day. And now they are caught in this strange situation where they want to carry out retribution against courageous whistleblowers in their own caucus. The Prime Minister is determined to have them kicked out and punished for speaking their minds, but nobody knows the legal status of an expulsion from the Liberal caucus. Mr. Speaker, I bring this to your attention because it could land on your desk. You could find yourself as the arbiter of this messy situation that the government has created for itself by failing to follow the legal steps that are provided for in the Parliament of Canada Act. Now, I have my opinions on whether or not the members of the former Treasury Board President and the Attorney General should or should not be allowed to remain. I think absolutely they have the right to remain. In fact, they should be celebrated for their courage and for their honesty. But I believe that decision should be, whatever decision the Liberals make, and it is theirs to make, not mine, should be done in accordance with the law. The Prime Minister appears follow the law. The Prime Minister broke the law when he took a $250,000 free vacation from someone who was seeking a government grant. He has broken, at the very least, the spirit of the law by applying inappropriate pressure and interfering in the criminal prosecution of his corporate friends SNC-Lavalin. For God's sakes, let him not break the law as he carries out retribution against the courageous whistleblowers who exposed him for that earlier misconduct. He has some time in order to fix the legal problems within his caucus. He could potentially, with counsel from you, Mr. Speaker, and the law clerk, convene another caucus meeting to discuss the application of the Reform Act to his caucus. I believe that after he does that, he would have to table in the House of Commons a full report on how he and his caucus have come into compliance with that act. But failing that, he is operating lawlessly as he attempts to punish those who have spoken against him. And speaking of the law, there is another law that's worth noting in this affair. And it is the whistleblower protection law that exists for public servants. I was proud to serve as the parliamentary secretary in the Harper government that passed into effect the Accountability Act, which contained protections for whistleblowers. You'll recall that the impetus for this act was that a courageous whistleblower, Alan Cutler, had spoken up against the sponsorship scandal. He witnessed that money was being funneled out of the coffers of the government into the Liberal Party of Canada and to Liberal-linked ad agencies. He blew the whistle and he was fired. He was fired for speaking up. He suffered serious career damage as a result. So we passed a law to protect public sector whistleblowers in the event that they witness wrongdoing. They are allowed under the law to make a formal complaint, to seek an investigation with the Public Service Integrity Commissioner, who then carries out an investigation. Now, I acknowledge that the Public Service Integrity Commissioner does not have jurisdiction over a party caucus or over cabinet ministers. It strictly applies to members of the public service. However, this is about the example we set as political leaders. If we have a law that protects public servants who blow the whistle against retaliation, how could the Prime Minister violate the principles of that law by punishing the whistleblowers in his own cabinet? What message would he send to public servants about the propriety of standing up and speaking out when you see something wrong if he punishes the very people who've done just that? The Prime Minister should do is first apologize to both of these whistleblowers, and secondly, thank them. Thank them for standing in his way when he was trying to behave inappropriately. The Attorney General may have done this Prime Minister, the former Attorney General, may have done this Prime Minister an incredible service when she refused his personal and political interference in the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin. She may have been helping him in a strange way by stopping him from doing something very dangerous, both to himself and to our legal and justice system. She warned him in the most emphatic way that he ought not push her any further. Allow me for a moment, Mr. Speaker, to reflect on the chronology of those warnings. It started on September 18th, 2018, when the Prime Minister and the Clerk of the Privy Council called in the Attorney General and pushed her to allow a settlement with SNC-Lavalin that would shelve criminal charges for fraud and bribery. She made clear at that point she wasn't interested in giving the company a special deal, as the company simply did not qualify for a settlement. He pushed some more. He made up stories about how the company headquarters would leave if she did not immediately intervene. Stories we now know are patently false. Still, she stood her ground, so he pushed again. And so she says, I looked him in the eye. And I said, Prime Minister, are you interfering with my work as Attorney General? Because I strongly advise against it. You'd think he would have got the message, but unfortunately that was just the beginning. Then, in the days that followed, his senior staff would continue the pressure campaign. The finance minister would jump in on the action as well. Strangely, he personally met with senior...
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader on a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that you take into consideration procedures and practices, in particular if we were to go to page 625, repetition and relevance in debate. The rules of relevance and repetition are intertwined and mutually reinforcing. The requirements that speeches remain relevant to the question before the House flows from the latter's right to reach decisions without undue obstruction and to exclude from debate any discussion not conducive to that end. The rule against repetition helps to ensure that the expeditious conduct of debate by prohibiting the repetition of arguments already made. To neglect either rule would seriously impair the ability of the House to manage its time effectively. If you just take a look at the hours of discussion from the member across the way, you will find that there is consistent duplication, repetition, repeating the same points after the same points, and we're actually talking about the 2019-2020 budget. I just bring it to your attention so maybe periodically we can just get the member to go back to what the debate's about, and that is the budget.
I thank the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for raising the point. Of course, what he says I am in complete familiarity with. It is a topic that does come up from time to time. One of the limitations on that for chair occupants is, of course, that one has to actually hear what the member says before one can be enlightened as to whether a bridge has been crossed or a line has been crossed in terms of repetition and relevance. That's one of the difficulties in coming to that conclusion. And I can assure the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary that I'll remain vigilant and listen carefully to what the Honourable Member has to say, and certainly, should it be necessary, to remind him, as with all honourable members when they're in the midst of debate, to avoid, in fact, steer clear from a repetition of arguments that have already been presented to the House, and to ensure that they are relevant to the question that's at hand. Final point on that simply is that, of course, on budgetary matters, the degree of liberty that members have to make their arguments on budget matters, of course, is quite vast. And so with that in mind, we'll listen carefully. I do see a couple of other honourable members on their feet. The honourable member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston. Is this on the same point of order? The honourable member.
It is, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to say that while I appreciate that the honourable parliamentary secretary is here more or less all the time and in consequence hears every single word that is spoken in this House, and I am not here quite as frequently, having committee duty and so on, I do want to observe that the reason I'm still here right now is because of the fact that the honourable member was making novel points that I was not yet familiar with, and I don't see, in fact, that from my perspective, there is repetition going on. Thank you.
Formact.
The honourable member for Brantford Brant, is this on the same point of order? The honourable
Rocky Ridge.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. The honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge, is on the same point of order?
Yes, it is, Mr.
The honourable member.
Thank you. And I listened carefully to the intervention from the parliamentary secretary to the government House leader, and I have risen myself on this standing order a number of times in this Parliament, and I note that in response to members that have brought the rule of relevance to your attention, that in this Parliament there has been a very broad use and application of this standing order, and that's been the answer from the chair in most instances. In fact, almost every instance I can think of where this is raised. So I assume that that will continue and that there will be broad latitude given on this standing order.
I thank the honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge and apologize for getting his riding name wrong and not mentioning anything about the similarities in look with the honourable member for Brantford Brant. Two outstanding gentlemen, I'm sure, but nonetheless, we do make that mistake from time to time. I thank all honourable members for their interventions. As this is an important standing order for the House, and we'll be observant of that and pay close attention. We'll go back now to the honourable member for Carleton.
Mr. Speaker. I will note with interest that the Liberals now claim that the matter of deferred prosecution agreements has nothing to do with budget policy. That is ironic indeed, because those deferred prosecution agreements were created in the budget bill that they introduced here in the House of Commons. So if they thought at the time that it was not a budget measure, why'd they put it in the budget? They thought it was completely irrelevant to the budget. Why was it in the budget bill? Yeah. And the answer is, of course, is that it should never have been in the budget. But now that it has been, it is perfectly fair game during this budget debate to discuss it. And we learn, Mr. Speaker, every day another form of deceit, another contradiction, just like this one. You know, less than a year ago, Liberals were claiming that this tool to allow corporations to avoid trial was a budget measure. They forced it through the Finance Committee, through the House of Commons, then through the Senate Finance Committee, again and again claiming this is a budget matter. And now we have a member who stands up and says, this has nothing to do with the budget, it's completely irrelevant. And isn't that the whole story of this scandal?
Absolutely.
One flip-flop after another, one change after another in the version of events and in the stories that they tell. They will say anything at any time in order to justify their inappropriate conduct. And this intervention by the colleague across the way is just the latest example of that. I can point to other contradictions, you know, where the Prime Minister says, here is it, on February 15th, he came out and said to 37 million Canadians, if anyone, including the former Attorney General, had issues with anything they might have experienced in this government, or didn't feel that we were living up to the high standards we set for itself, it was her responsibility to come forward. It was their responsibility to come forward. And no one did. And yet, of course, that is absolutely false. She did come forward again and again and again, to the Prime Minister personally on September 18th, then to his clerk of the Privy Council, when she said in a recorded conversation about which top Liberals cannot lie and deny because it is all caught on tape, she said, so we are treading on dangerous ground here, and I'm going to issue my stern warning because I cannot act in a manner and the prosecution cannot act in a manner that is not objective, that isn't independent. I cannot act in a partisan way, and I cannot be politically motivated. All of this screams of that. Now, if that is not a warning, I don't know what is. Now, the latest story from the Prime Minister is he never heard about that conversation. You know, when an Attorney General has an explosive conversation of this nature with the top public servant about a priority file for the Prime Minister, and in the 2 months that follows, the Prime Minister does not hear a word about it. Now, of course, the story from the government was that, oh, he didn't hear about it because he immediately left for vacation. Well, it turns out the public record shows that's false. He didn't leave for vacation. He does take a lot of vacations, but unfortunately for his story, this was not one of the occasions when he did take such a vacation. And even if he had, this is what the clerk himself said on the availability of the Prime Minister. He said, there are multiple occasions where the minister could have expressed her concern to the Prime Minister, and every single day could have picked up the phone and called. Now, he goes on to say that the Prime Minister is available through the switchboard 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and is working 7 days a week. The Prime Minister is interrupted all the time for calls with foreign leaders, security matters, heads up, end quote. So in other words, I'm going to go on further actually. All ministers have the option of reaching the Prime Minister, give or take a little bit of scheduling and where he might be in private time and so on. Every minister of the Cabinet can reach the Prime Minister. I presume if that is true, then the clerk of the Privy Council could have found time in the 2 months that followed this extraordinary conversation with the Attorney General to relay its contents to the Prime Minister, but yet they expect us to believe he never did. And so the Prime Minister didn't know anything. His Chief of Staff was involved in the interference, but he didn't know. His principal secretary and best friend was involved, but the Prime Minister didn't know. His senior advisor, Mathieu Bouchard, was involved, but the Prime Minister didn't know. The Prime Minister's top advisor, Elder Marquise, was involved in the interference, but the Prime Minister didn't know. The Finance Minister was involved in the interference, but the Prime Minister didn't know. The Finance Minister's Chief of Staff, Ben Chin, was involved in the interference, but the Prime Minister didn't know. Everyone was involved in this, as we now know, because of documented text message conversations, journal entries, and even audio recordings, right up to the Clerk of the Privy Council, but we're expected to believe that the Prime Minister did not know a thing.
But he worked
You know,
24 hours.
he works according to the Clerk of the Privy Council. He works 24/7 and is available at any time, could be reached easily and brought up to date on all these matters. But somehow this one just slipped right by him. Mr. Speaker, why is it that Canadians find that so hard to believe? The answer is because it is not true. And that brings us to the matter of the Ethics Committee, which will convene on Tuesday, a week from today, to decide whether to carry out a full-scale investigation and hear from all of the key witnesses who are alleged to have interfered in the SNC-Lavalin scandal. We will be calling on all members of the Liberal Party to vote in favor of this study, but particularly the two members who said they were open to such investigation, but that it had just been too premature at the time it was brought before the committee when it last met. The Prime Minister needs to understand something that has become very difficult for him to appreciate. And it is this: the House of Commons does not work for him. It's the other way around. He holds that office only as long as a majority of MPs in this place say he holds that office. It's not an entitlement. It's not a family heirloom to be handed down from father to son. It is the property of the Canadian people. And through their delegation to us, it is our job to decide whether or not he is able to hold that office. And in the meantime, this chamber and its committees are one gigantic accountability machine. An accountability machine that demands answers for the government's conduct, in particularly the Prime Minister's conduct. This is not the Prime Minister's personal self-esteem factory. We don't exist here to try and elevate his sense of ego and self-importance. It is not the job of parliamentarians to gush and praise all over him and treat him with the adoration he expects and demands. That's not what Parliament does. Parliament is supposed to ask the difficult questions until such time as we get accurate and believable answers. So far, they have not been forthcoming. And so we march on, and I continue speaking on behalf of my constituents. But I think in this sense, I'm carrying out the role that all MPs are supposed to do, which is to stand up, speak up, and fight back when they see something wrong. Exactly. You know something? It's not only opposition MPs that do that. There are courageous members of the government side who have been willing to take a principled position. For example, former Attorney General. She was prepared to put her principles ahead of her career ambitions. And then you have the former Treasury Board President, who likewise said she was not prepared to be part of the cover-up and that there's much more to this story that needs to be told. So, let's tell it. I'm ready to end my speech now. All I need is for a member of the government to stand up and commit that the Ethics Committee, the majority Liberal-controlled Ethics Committee, will open a full-scale investigation into the SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal. As soon as one member of the other side rises and purports to speak on behalf of the Prime Minister himself, I will terminate my remarks and allow the debate to go on otherwise. But until that happens, or until you stop me, Mr. Speaker, I will continue to speak up for accountability in the SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal. And I thank the members who are here with me, providing moral support for me to stand here on behalf of the Conservative caucus, but also on behalf of my constituents. And, I notice a member is rising on a point of order.
I see the honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge. Now, he's in a different location, so I'm not sure which is his. I recall recognizing him from a different location, and I'll have to consult the seating chart to see which of it, in fact, was correct. Perhaps I was incorrect the last time. Oh, I see that he's in a different spot there now, so we must have been correct. So I see the honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge rising. Is this on a point of order?
Well,
I'd ask the honourable Carleton to take his seat.
Indeed I am, and my apologies. I momentarily had forgotten the requirement to be in one's proper chair while rising, and my apologies to you, and thank you for me being able to catch your eye and rise. Just to speak for a moment, I want to confirm and ensure, as we have had debate and points of order have been raised on the rule of relevance and repetition, and it is not clear to me that all of the facts and arguments have been made properly on that. So I just want to bring to your attention, Mr. Speaker, page 632 of Boscan Gagnon describes debates on the address and reply to the throne to the speech from the throne and the budget. The traditions and practices of the House allow for the rule of relevance to be relaxed during debate on the motion for an address in reply to the speech from the throne. During the days allotted to the debate on this motion, private members have the opportunity, quote, to bring forward topics of their own choosing, unquote. Consequently, debate tends to be very wide-ranging, and the Speaker usually makes no effort to apply the rule of relevance. This is not the case, however, when the House is debating the budget. The remarks of the members must be relevant to the motion before the House. All the same, the terms of the motion, i.e. that this House approve in general the budgetary policy of the government, are sufficiently broad to permit members great latitude in their remarks.
Order. Order. I thank the honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge for these additional points. I think they effectively repeat some of the comments that were just recently remarks made upon both from myself and other honourable members. And as I indicated at the time, I'm quite cognizant of the scope around which the issues around relevance in particular are measured. And as I say, I'll continue to listen carefully to the honourable member for Carleton in that respect. And should it be necessary to interrupt him and bring that to his attention, I'll do so. Other than that, I'll consider the matter closed for the time being. The honourable member for Carleton. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's just, before we get to that, I just want to, before we get to the honourable member of Carleton, I'll let him take his seat for a moment. And this is in respect to Standing Order 38, to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows.
The honourable member for Drummond concerning official languages. The honourable member for North Island Powell River on Indigenous affairs, and the honourable member for Regina Leuven on natural resources. And now we will continue resuming debate. The honourable member for Carleton.
Mr. Speaker. Where we last left off was on the importance of holding governments to account. This here is the House of the Common People, where we restrain the Crown and limit its powers to maximize the liberty of the people. In this particular instance, the allegation is that the Prime Minister personally and politically interfered with the criminal prosecution of a powerful corporation. In other words, the judicial branch of government suffered or almost suffered a major act of interference by the head of the executive branch, or the head of the government, I should say, in the person of the Prime Minister. And we, as Parliament, we are the legislative branch, but we have the accountability mechanism here in the form of question period committees and other tools at our disposal to bring the Prime Minister back in check when he abuses the other branches of government. In other words, we do not, as legislators, dominate the judicial branch. We merely provide it with the laws it interprets. But we can act as its protectors here in this House of Commons in instances where the executive has spilled over and invaded the territory of the judicial branch. And that is precisely what we are doing. Just as the judicial branch sometimes must constrain the executive, particularly when the executive infringes the rights of the population, we as parliamentarians in the legislative branch can also restrain the executive when it attacks the sacred ground of the judicial branch. And that appears to be what the Prime Minister attempted. The decision to prosecute a enterprise charged with fraud and bribery is one left to independent prosecutors in the office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Interference in that prosecution by any member of the executive has the effect of contaminating the judicial branch with politics. And we here, as parliamentarians, are the decontamination team. We're here to decontaminate the corruption that spilled out of the executive almost into the judicial branch, but for the courageous acts of an Attorney General who closed the floodgates and prevented that contamination from spilling completely in to this criminal trial. Thank God she was there. What a relief. I think Canadians should breathe a sigh of relief that we had such a woman of integrity doing that job at that moment. Do you ever think, Mr. Speaker, that things happen for a reason? That people are in a certain place at a certain time because they're especially needed there? You know, I think of, go back to the end of the beginning of the 1940s, May of 1940, when Europe was collapsing under the aggressive attacks of a evil and mendacious dictator. France was, if it hadn't already, was soon to surrender. Germany had already successfully attacked numerous of its neighbors. And Chamberlain, who had of course signed a peace in our time treaty with Hitler, was on the verge of almost losing confidence in the British House of Commons. while he, I think, commanded a majority still, it was clear that he did not have enough support in the Commons to carry out a war effort. And so there's this story of a famous meeting where Churchill, Chamberlain, and Lord Halifax gathered together in one room. Oh, to have been a fly on that wall. It was clear Chamberlain was on his way out, and the obvious replacement, of course, was Lord Halifax. Most people would have assumed Churchill. Now, who was Lord Halifax and what was his plan? Well, he was a widely respected member of the aristocratic elite, a senior conservative in the British Parliament. He had engaged in efforts already in the early stages of the Second World War to initiate negotiations for the surrender of all of mainland Europe to Hitler. He initiated those negotiations through Mussolini. In other words, he was going to ask Mussolini to be the mediator in negotiations between Great Britain and Hitler on the surrender of Europe. That was his plan. And the three of them went into this meeting expecting that Lord Halifax would come out as Prime Minister. And as certain historical accounts relay the events, Chamberlain said, I believe I am losing the confidence of our caucus and perhaps of our Commons, and I no longer can continue prosecuting this war. I will resign, and the question is, who should replace me? I think it should be Lord Halifax. And Lord Halifax, as the story is told, said, no, I think it should be Winston Churchill. Of course, Winston Churchill said, I agree. And thank goodness that happened, because days later, when Churchill would become Prime Minister, he fundamentally altered the policy of the British government. It wasn't just that he was giving these stirring addresses to rouse the nation. There are many of those examples, and we can get lost in the soaring and brilliant rhetoric of the time. However, what we miss sometimes is that he had actually changed the policy of the British government from one of survival to one of victory. He said, what is our aim, you ask? Victory. Victory at any cost. And he prosecuted the war with that full intention in mind. It wasn't to delay and frustrate the enemy for a later date when they could one day renegotiate a settlement. It was to totally obliterate Hitler's Third Reich, and that's exactly what he did. But imagine if Lord Halifax had come out of that room as Prime Minister. Imagine the different world we would live in today. He would have attempted to negotiate a settlement that would have surrendered all of Western Europe to a monster. But instead, we had a courageous lion who was prepared to fight and win at any cost. We might live in a very different world today had Winston Churchill, then who in the years leading up to that moment was a very controversial and often very isolated backbencher in his wilderness years of the 1930s, emerged as the Prime Minister, an unlikely Prime Minister, but arguably the most consequential one in modern history. So I relay this story merely to point out that sometimes certain people are in certain places at the right time. And though the stakes are nowhere near as high today as they were then, I think we will all admit, there's no doubt that there is something very important at stake in this particular controversy as well, and it is the independence of the prosecutorial arm of the government from politics. And had it been another Attorney General, someone more malleable, someone whose convictions were rested on sand rather than on stone, we might have had a different outcome. That person might have said, sure, look, Clearly, the Prime Minister wants this. It's illegal, but he gets what he wants. We know how he is. The clerk has made it clear that he's in a mood, and he's going to get it done one way or another. A less courageous and principled Attorney General might have just folded like a cheap suit and allowed that to happen. But it wasn't someone else. It was this Attorney General. And she stood up again and again and again. And they pushed, and they pushed, and they pushed, and she wouldn't back down. Till she finally said, I feel like I'm going to witness the Saturday Night Massacre, a reference to Nixon's Watergate firings. She said to the clerk of the Privy Council, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. And it did. Less than a month later, the Prime Minister would shuffle his cabinet and punch her from her position, making up a confusing and incredible, fantastic story about a game of musical chairs that resulted from the simple resignation of one Treasury Board's president, who was completely unrelated to the situation at hand. And she was then replaced with another Attorney General who the Prime Minister thought would be more malleable, which takes us to the future. What can Canadians expect of this case if the government is re-elected? If this Prime Minister continues in office, they can expect that within weeks he will direct his Attorney General, someone he believes will do his bidding, to sign a special deal with SNC-Lavalin. That's what he's done twice before. Once, on December 8th, 2015, when his government immediately on taking office granted an exemption to SNC-Lavalin, allowing it to continue bidding on federal contracts, even though it was charged with banned from bidding for being charged with fraud and bribery. And then a second time, he attempted to provide a special deal for SNC-Lavalin in the controversy we are now discussing with his former Attorney General. Let there be no doubt that if this Prime Minister is re-elected, within days, he will interrupt the criminal proceeding, the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin, to protect the company against trial. Now, he has noted, and so have his staff and former staff, that they can do this right up until the moment that a verdict or a plea is rendered. In other words, he knows he has time on his hands. He knows that if he's back in office, he can try this same game all over again. He has shown a relentless determination to allow this corporation to avoid criminal prosecution, and he will carry out that determination if he's given the chance after the next election. That is yet another reason we cannot allow him to serve in this office 1 minute longer than necessary. We need to replace him with a Prime Minister who respects the independence of both the judiciary and the prosecution, so that decisions of criminal charges are rendered by judges and juries, not by politicians. Yep. That key separation is essential for the successful functioning of any democracy. And that's precisely why we are holding him accountable for his already egregious interference. And it is further why we will argue to the Canadian people for the need to replace him, to make sure this kind of odious, monstrous interference is never allowed to repeat itself again. You know, I look around this chamber today, and the member from the Okanagan who is here, he was among the very first to notice this strange amendment to the criminal code that popped into the omnibus budget bill there we were, 10 o'clock at night, turning 500 pages as we rushed to pass this bill that Prime Minister said needed to become law quickly. And all of a sudden, there it was, right before us, an amendment to the criminal code, right in the middle of a budget bill. You know, the last thing we ever thought to find there. It was like finding fish in trees. So completely out of place it was. And only one witness to comment on it, and it was a public servant who simply gave the technical explanation of what it was, and that was it. No anti-corruption crusaders, no corporate accountability experts, no law professors would come forward and explain to us what we were getting ourselves into. And by the way, we have to move quickly. We got to get this passed. And all of us were asking the same question. Who's asking for this? Who wants this? I mean, we all go to the church suppers or the neighborhood farms, or we knock on the doors of our communities in the suburbs of Canada, and nobody ever says, you know, our laws are really cruel to corporate criminals. We really ought to find a way to let the crooks get off without conviction. Maybe they could just pay a fine, fess up, promise not to do it again, and that would suffice. Enough with all this business of trials and convictions. Enough with calling the executives before the court to testify under oath. That's too inhumane. We need to find a nicer way to do it. I don't remember hearing that from anyone in my constituency in the tens of thousands of doors I've been knocking on since last summer. But yet, it was indeed a top budget priority of this government in mid-2018. And then, of course, it became the Prime Minister's top priority in relation to his Attorney General in September, as soon as that Criminal Code amendment became law. All of a sudden, it was a panic. She had to be called in on the carpet to answer for the clerk and the Prime Minister about why she hadn't moved with haste to direct the Director of Public Prosecutions to extend this settlement offer to SNC-Lavalin. The company was concerned. It was telling the clerk of the Privy Council and others about a board meeting that would come up on September 20th, only days away. Can't you get us off of these fraud and bribery charges within the next week? We've got a board meeting, for God's sakes. How are we supposed to do business? You know? And of course, the right answer that a normal Prime Minister would give if a corporation came in and made such a demand would be, get out of my office. Right. Go to court. If you think you did nothing wrong, defend your case and get acquitted. But I don't want to see you around here ever again. That would have been the right answer. But the Prime Minister just kept inviting them back again and again. Come on back. We're doing everything we can for you. We just have this one problem. This one problem we have with our Attorney General. And here she is, getting in our way, mucking up our plans. We had set it up so that SNC could just get off without trial. We even amended the criminal code to make it possible for this one company. And we've got this nuisance Attorney General who won't just play ball. Well, she's got a few months to get it done, or we're going to move her out. And that's exactly what they did. They sent her packing because she wouldn't play ball. Shame. The old boys told her how things were going to work, and she says, no, where I come from, we have the rule of law, and it doesn't work that way. And so they said, unfortunately, you're no longer the Attorney General. And they found someone perhaps more malleable. Now, Prime Minister says that decision had nothing, the cabinet shuffle had nothing to do with her refusal to cooperate and give a deal to SNC-Lavalin. But here's what we know for sure. when she was the Attorney General, the answer to SNC-Lavalin's request for a settlement was no. It was a clear no. She looked at the act, she looked at the decision of the prosecutor, and she said, it ain't gonna happen.